Alrighty, okay. Hello everyone. I feel like I've met maybe one or two as you walked in, but basically no one else. I'm Jack, I'm Australian, so I'm not really meant to be in Europe, but I'm on exchange in London, which is why I'm around. And Dom asked me to come to a seminar about religion. So I'll cover a few things. Usual disclaimers for religion debates is I'm not religious. So you guys many of you who might be religious probably know a lot more about it, like from a personal level than I do. I've studied it a little bit in university, so I've done a lot of kind of history side of religion, lots of like Indonesian religion, a bit of sort of sin in the Middle Ages, that kind of stuff. And then I've just sort of thought about it a lot for debating. So I'll just talk about it from kind of a debating perspective as much as I can. And as always, that means it's just my takes. Like this isn't like the gospel or anything. So there's probably other things to go through. Other things mentioned, structure. I'll first talk about how religion, sort of some numbers stuff, some like math stuff that's kind of useful for debating to think about. Then I'll talk about how religions are centralized and decentralized. Then on religious reforms and sort of the ways we change how we interpret religion. And finally, I'll talk about why it matters. And I'll try and talk about motions where I can. Like I'm going to try and keep it pretty like debating relevant, but I will occasionally just stray to talk about stuff I think is interesting as well. All right, okay. There's a lot of text on the slides. You don't need to like write it down or anything. It's just so I remember what I'm saying. So the interesting thing about debating is that oftentimes people's interpretations about, there we go. That's good. Often people's interpretations about what you think about what you are debating about differs from what is statistically true, right? So like in debating, theoretically everyone is equal. Theoretically, unless someone makes argumentation to suggest that X group of stakeholders is more important than Y group of stakeholders for some reason, it is the case that you should preference everyone equally and give equal support to everyone. But the reason that's interesting in a debating context is that when you're debating about religion, most people have very strict interpretations or intuitions about what kind of religious people are like, which are not really factual. So everyone's got an intuition that like religious people are X way. They debate for that stakeholder. And it is very useful if you know more about Y stakeholder than about the fake stakeholder they make up, because that then allows you to kind of run fun extensions, run arguments that apply to real people. So some super basic breakdowns. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the main religions are the ones that are proselytizing. So Christianity and Islam are proselytizing in the sense that they are, as part of your religion, you're meant to go out and convince people. So that's dawah in Islam, and then the missionary duty or the evangelicism duty in Christianity. So both of those are pretty big. There's 2.5 billion Christians, 1.9 billion Muslims, and then a lot also of Hindus, agnostics, Buddhists, and some other religions. I will mostly talk about the first four. So I'll mostly talk about Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. But I guess there are also lots of other religions and things that kind of are debatably religions. Like for example, Buddhism, many scholars think is actually just a philosophy and not really a religion. But I guess the definition of what a religion is quite contested. So that's the first thing to remember, is that there are a lot more religious people in the world than there are non-religious people. Like those numbers, if you add them up together, it's like 80% of the world's population, which suggests that if you are doing a debate about almost anything in the world, it should be religious. So a good example recently is at Glasgow Ancients, which some of you may have gone to, others may not. At Glasgow, we set a grand final, which was like that we should like select who's in charge of running an AI that runs the world or something. And that votion, we initially were like the most respected moral philosopher would be the people that got to run the AI. But then the most respected moral philosophy is almost certainly just like the Pope and the Dalai Lama, because those people are the ones who, the majority of people in the world would suggest other people that are morally correct, because they're the ones who follow them in religion. So it's kind of useful to think about the fact that almost everyone from a debating standpoint is religious. Like the vast majority of people you're going to be making argumentation about believes in religion. The other thing that's really interesting to think about statistically is trends in religion, again, are very different to what people expect are the case. So if you say in a debate, religion is declining in the world, most people will agree with you. Like the judge will kind of treat that as like OAV knowledge, that they're like, yeah, religion is declining. But that is almost entirely untrue. So there are more numbers of religious believers in most parts of the world, especially in the US, where it's very stable, which is about like 62% of Americans are Christians, mostly Protestants and a few Catholics. And the reason that's happened is firstly, because a number of young people now are more religious than you would expect them to be. So it's been going down over time, and young people have stopped going down. And secondly, there's always been a gender gap in American religion. So women have overwhelmingly been more religious than American men, but that has stopped happening for some reason in the most recent generation, which is probably due to the like politics thing where men are becoming more right-wing, and that's being associated with being Christian. So again, increased numbers of believers there. Same thing is true in sub-Saharan Africa, where even if the relative amount of religious people isn't changing, so the number of like people who believe in Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa as a proportion of the population is not changing, but the population of sub-Saharan Africa relative to the rest of the world is massively increasing. So in the future, there will be more Catholics just because the number of Catholics in sub-Saharan Africa is going to increase because the population is increasing. Same thing is true in North Africa and Turkey. Turkey is especially interesting because it used to be very secular and has become more religious lately because of these religious orders which are very, very influential. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that it's becoming more conservative. So again, there's kind of a trend in many, like in our minds basically to be like, yeah, religion is becoming more progressive as society becomes more progressive. The stats suggest that in most contexts, many religions are becoming more conservative, especially Catholicism and especially in America. So the priests today, if you poll them and you're like, do you think of yourself as conservative? About 80% will say, yes, I think I'm conservative. Whereas in the 1960s, when you polled priests, they would say, yes, I think I'm progressive. So the self-image of priests is changing a lot. There's a lot of things, if you're debating about why people are getting more conservative, I think the basic thing to do is think about them as the same way with judges. So when we pick judges, we're like, okay, we pick them from bad foundations and they're kind of trained in bad ways. Same thing is true here, where it's like there's pipeline institutions that are very conservative. There's big news networks, so EWTN, which is I forget the acronym, it's like the most important news network for Catholics. That is extremely conservative. And then I guess Trump has politicized Catholicism as well. And the final thing that's interesting to think about is that even if the numbers of religious people are staying the same, and what they believe is staying the same, people are increasingly believing that more, so they're believing it to a kind of greater religious extent. So some really interesting stats are around the Hajj and the Umrah, which is like where in Islam you're meant to go to Mecca, right? Like you guys know the thing where you like walk around the rock? Yeah. So the number of people that are meant to do the Hajj is going up crazy amounts. So Saudi Arabia is expecting the next like 10 years or something to double it to 30 million people, which is causing all sorts of problems for the Hajj because that means loads of people die because there's like so many people walking the roads and they've got to do stupid stuff like the road that goes from Mecca to one of the pilgrimage sites is now just a travelator and they like spray you with water as you walk down the travelator. And that's because people are believing in religion more. So even if people are relatively similarly religious, many more people around the world are believing in it to an interesting extent. This is not uniform, so I guess a good example of being not uniform is that China has been getting more anti-Islam lately. So it's done a lot of stuff like destroying and modifying mosques. So I guess if you look at images of mosques in China, they traditionally were very Islamic in architectural style and have been kind of renovated to make them look more Chinese. But generally across the world, your intuitions about people being less and less religious being more and more moderate, etc., are declining, and your intuitions about who believes in what kind of religion is also changing. A final example of that is the numbers of, oh, I made my slides are normally wrong, that's okay. Behind the numbers, even if people are the same amount of religiousness, the way that they believe in that stuff has changed as well. So I think two really good examples of this is firstly, people believing in things is kind of insufficiently descriptive. So when you were talking about the conclave, probably everyone when they were talking about conclave was like, well, are they more left-wing or right-wing cardinals? Like we're gonna pick like Raymond Burke, the really conservative cardinal from the US, or someone really woke like Tagle or Zupi. But in fact, as everyone probably talked about, they weren't really picking on conservativeness or progressiveness. Like they were mostly picking on like who has takes on this one really niche random philosophy thing, or like who has better ideas about how to reform the finances of the church. So a similar thing is true for almost all other religions, where people's engagement with the religion is more complicated than just I believe or I don't believe, or it's more complicated than I believe in a conservative way or I believe in a woke way. Like there's actually a lot more complexity behind the scenes. I think a really good example is in Indonesia. So in Indonesia, there's like a four-way axis of like what you can believe in, right? You can be a Bangan, which is where you're like a bit Islamic, but you also have lots of other kind of folk religions, like you believe in kind of reincarnation, a lot of Java stuff. Or you can be very, very more Santri, which is like where you're much more traditionally Muslim, right? Like you believe in all the practices, you reject things like idolatry, believing in false gods, etc. So that's one axis. And the other axis is how progressive or conservative you are, which in Indonesia sort of maps into whether you're Muhammadiyah, which is more modernist, and in that context, modernist means like 1920s, so conservative in our conception, or you're more traditional, which in our conception would be, generally speaking, more progressive, in which case you believe in Nahdlatul Ulama. So there's a four-way map in which people could be more traditionally Catholic, more traditionally Islamic, but also also more progressive in that way, or they could be much less traditionally Islamic, but the Islamic beliefs they do have are much more conservative. So it's much important to kind of think about people's religious beliefs as very complicated. There's like a lot of factors behind the scenes. And so oftentimes in debates, you get into a position where like, you're CG, and top half just spent the whole time being like, well, there are like certain woke Catholics and certain like conservative Catholics, and this is how their brains work. And if you are just more nuanced and more interesting than that, I think that gives you a great advantage. The other thing that I think is important to remember is that when people believe in things in religion, that is obviously not politically free or neutral. Like they don't do so out of just like they wake up one day and they decide to believe in that religion. And everyone I think is pretty good at making arguments about this. Like most people are pretty good at making arguments that suggest X group is more radical, Y group forces you to believe in a religion. But I think what people are less good at making arguments about is the way that what religions teach people is very socially constructed. So a really good example of this is the divide that you might have heard of between Sunni and Shia Islam. Have we kind of like heard of this before? Yeah, it's like they disagree on some like arcane division of like who the 12th person to succeed Abu Bakr is meant to be. Yeah, so these two religions, in the modern day, everyone's like they hate each other, right? Like they fight each other all the time. Whenever anyone talks about the Middle East, they're like, yeah, the Iraqis in Iraq, so the Sunnis in Iraq and the Shias in Iraq hate each other. But a lot of that division is kind of made up, like recently made up groups in the government have tried to exaggerate people's divisions. So for example, after the Arab Spring in Bahrain in 2011, Bahrain's government was like, okay, we've got a problem, which is that most people in our country are mobilizing against the government and mobilizing against the monarchy. So we need to kind of dispel the people that are fighting against us. So they engaged in what a good author who should read called Nada Hashmi calls sectarianization, which is like, we're going to stress the fact that this is not a popular uprising against the government. It is a Shia uprising against Sunnis. And so they do things like police Sunni communities, but not Shia, so Shia communities, not Sunni ones. So that everyone's like, oh, well, all the cops are in the Shia areas. That must mean the Shia are the problem. Or they do stuff like get people on social media and they pay them to say, oh, this like Shia came and attacked me because they hate me. And then they pay some Shias to be like, oh, I hate Sunnis. And then finally, they make all these organizations for Sunnis, like the Sunni Self-Defense League and stuff. And so you're like, okay, if I'm a Sunni, I should join these leagues. And so what that ends up doing is, well, now the conflict is not really people fighting against the Bahraini government. It's just Shias fighting against Sunnis, which is much worse, right? Because then everyone who's Sunni is like, okay, I've got to lock in behind the Bahraini government. And then especially because everyone hates Iran, and Iran is the only Shia country, everyone's like, okay, I've got to lock in away from Iran in favor of Bahrain's government. So that's, I think, the other important thing to remember, is that the kind of complex ways that people choose to believe in religion is often something that's outside of their control, and also often something that's much more nuanced than we think about, which gives you the opportunity to be, I guess, a bit more progressive and a bit more nuanced in the way you debate about religion. Within that context, there are kind of three themes of religion I want to talk about in this seminar, because I think these are the ones that tend to come up the most in debating, though other stuff does come up a lot as well. The first one is religious hierarchy. And that's because, A, there's a lot of debates about religious hierarchy. Some examples are Copenhagen Open reset a Krabi APP motion, which is something that Europeans do a lot. They often reset the APP motions because they happen a bit earlier. So if you ever want to know that a European comp is going to set, just look at the previous year's APP motions. And so they reset a motion which is something like, this house believes that all religious positions should be in the hands of, all like religious heads should be elected, which is a very common debate, right? Everyone always sets these debates, like we should elect religious leaders. Similarly, Princeton, in areas characterized by civic inequality, you should preach this particular doctrine. And Glasgow had one which is like, you should be a theocracy or something else. And all of those debates are basically about how do religious hierarchies work, like who is in charge of a hierarchy, who has control over the hierarchy. And the other reason this is really important is that it comes up a lot in mechanization. So if you're running any kind of mech about a religion debate, the mech is going to be someone at the top makes a decision, and that decision filters down to people. Or it's going to be people at the bottom start thinking something, and that filters up and changes stuff. So in both cases, it's kind of important to think about how a religion's structured, how their hierarchies work. And I will posit that there are kind of two types. There's an argument you can make about centralization, which is like religions are centralized, and there's an argument you can make about decentralization, which suggests that it's bottom up. The centralization argument is about religions where it is the case that there are centralized leaders who can implement policy. So I guess the classic example of the Pope, right? The Pope sometimes is like, we got to do this thing, and then everyone has to follow through and say that the Pope does that if they're Catholic. And there are two religions, I think, of the four I mentioned earlier, of Catholicism, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. I think Catholicism and Christianity, certain sects of Christianity are the ones that believe in this and follow this to the maximal extent. So Catholicism has the concept of what's called magisterium, which was developed by Vatican I, which is the council they did in the 1870s. And that basically said there are certain people in Catholicism who have the power to give authentic interpretations of what God meant when he said stuff. So they basically said, if God has said something, this can be passed down to someone else who can interpret what he said, and these particular people have the power to rationalize that. And so that's pretty contested. So a lot of people do not like that very much, and especially don't like it when popes say things they don't like. So you might know that there are lots of Catholics who don't really like Francis and were kind of happy he died. And the reason they were kind of happy about that is that Francis had done a lot of things that made the church more progressive in a way that people don't like. And there's also a lot of debates about like specifically what does the Pope say that has magisterium. So, for example, encyclicals, which are a thing he writes where he can say a certain opinion, those aren't technically magisterium. They're kind of like persuasive in the same way that a Supreme Court decision, some of them are binding, but some of them are just like, you've got to kind of follow them, but they're not really the rules. So a good example of that is Humanitae Vitae, which is one that was written back in the 80s, I forget by who, which is basically like, don't do contraception. And many people in the Catholic Church say that wasn't really like, doesn't count. Like they said don't do contraception, but like there wasn't any magisterium. Other people like they do have magisterium. That I think is not that important for the reason that the popes are kind of things that everyone's kind of good at debating. Like I think most people like know who the Pope is. Like everyone knows who Pope Leo is. We've kind of read a bit about Pope Leo. So I think it's not very useful you know too much about the popes because A, their decisions are super controlled, and B, they're just one person. I think much more important to think about the fact that the magisterium also gets put in bishops. So there are 5,600 or so bishops who are appointed by the Pope who have responsibility in certain areas. And they also have a magisterium. So it's kind of like, it's like courts where like their magisterium is like a bit less than the Pope's, like the Pope says something, that overrides what the bishops say. But most of the time the Pope doesn't talk about stuff because like there's so many pressures on the Pope, they've got so much stuff to do, that the people who actually end up making kind of decisions on doctrine are the bishops. And those bishops are appointed in kind of interesting ways at very different areas. The most famous example is that the Vatican recently signed a deal, or recently, like 7 or so years ago, in 2018, signed a deal with the CCP, which basically said after many, many years of the CCP hating the Catholic Church, not letting them in, they had a deal where the CCP gets to appoint the bishops, and in return the bishops can freely practice. So this Vatican basically said, all right, CCP, you can control who the bishops are, which in effect allows you to control what they say. So CCP has since enacted a law in 2021 that says, if you are a bishop, you must proclaim that, that China is the legitimate government and like we own Taiwan and like we should uphold socialist principles, etc. And in return, they got the ability to practice. So the reason there's controversy about stuff like that is that the people who are put in power as bishops have magisterium. They can control what people think. And they also do lots of other kind of stuff that matters to the way people think. They like govern parishes, they appoint your local priests, they make local pronouncements, etc. So Catholicism is centralized. The other religion inside Christianity that's centralized is Orthodox Christianity, which everyone forgets about, but statistically there are a lot of them. If I go back to my slides, I have the numbers. Yeah, there were like 290 million Eastern Orthodox people, which is not a lot relative to the 2.5 billion Christians, but is quite a lot relative to like any other debating mechanism. Like if you ran any other impact that affected 290 million people, it would be pretty significant. They also have hierarchies. They've got what's called autocephalous branches, which basically means they all hate each other. So there are like 17 different branches of Eastern Orthodox Christianity that all kind of disagree with each other and their own hierarchy. And the Oriental Church, which I can't believe they haven't renamed, again has their own hierarchy of like 6 different groups that all don't agree with each other's hierarchy, but are their own little hierarchies. The problem is, of course, that those religions that I've just named, or those denominations of Christianity, are not the majority of religious believers in the world. So the tricky thing then is how to establish that religions are centralized, even when they're not formally centralized. So like Buddhism, for example, not formally centralized. We'll talk about that in a second. There's no like chain of command in Buddhism. How do you explain that Buddhist people would still follow a chain of command? And I think there are 3 ways to do so. The first thing is that many religions have strong informal hierarchies. So a good example is Shia Islam, which initially had a concept of the imams. So initially they were like, yeah, there's these people descended from Muhammad who is appointed with power. Most Shia now believe that the imams have died out, so they've occluded, which basically means they've like left and there's no more lines of them, and they will come back one day. And so even though those have declined, the Shia do still believe in a very strict hierarchy, which is like locally prominent individuals, even if they are not religiously empowered, like even if they don't technically have a role, if they're more prominent, they get to override other less prominent people, which is how Iran works, for example. So Ayatollah Khamenei doesn't technically get to tell people what to do. Like technically from a religious side point, Ayatollah Khamenei or any of the other Ayatollahs did not actually have the power to define what the doctrine was, but they would be deferred to by less powerful people. So if you're a local clergyman or a local member of the ulama, you would not go, okay, Ayatollah Khamenei said this thing, but I think this other thing is true. You'd have to defer to them. So even if people are not technically following a hierarchy, there's kind of autonomous ways that people follow each other and listen to what each other say that is still really important in creating hierarchy. Secondly, even if a religion does not have a doctrine of like, you've got to follow someone's orders, they often have doctrines of consensus. We'll talk about this a bit when we talk about Sunni Islam in the next section on reinterpretation. But a lot of religions are like, if a majority of people believe X is true, we can act as if X is true, like we kind of follow consensus. And if you think about it, like any other time we come up with an idea of consensus, that's socially constructed, right? When we're like, everyone agrees X is true, that's like everyone is like the white guys who are in power in a certain country, or everyone is like who the mainstream media thinks is the case, or everyone is like who the certain people in positions of power have told you is everyone. And so again, when Sunni Islam says everyone believes X thing, like for example, recently, not that recently, in the last 200 years, when Sunni Islam says everyone agrees that slavery doesn't really count as part of the Quran, like the Quran didn't endorse slavery, that is what is suggested. Not everyone does actually agree. Boko Haram would disagree and tell you that slavery is allowed under Islam, but their idea of consensus is constructive. And finally, even if you have super individualistic religions, so best example of this is evangelical Christianity, which is like just basically like guys and sometimes girls just saying stuff and like people broadly following through. Like it's kind of based on individuals, like those people preaching is what creates the church. Their preaching still has a competition. So televangelism, which developed in America in the 80s and is now all over the world, is basically just where these people market themselves. So if you're a very powerful, influential pastor, you'll like market yourself to the rest of the public so that they are more likely to support you, type your church, etc. A really good example is this guy called Pastor Enoch Adoyele, who's preaching in Nigeria, has like, I think 14 million followers in Nigeria, also has like followers allegedly, this is what his page says, he has followers in 198 countries, which is kind of crazy because I think that's like all the countries there is. So he at least says that there are people in like Antarctica who follow his religion. And the reason that matters is that even if those people are just winning because they are like the ones who win the big televangelist budget and they spend the most on TV, or if you see those videos of like churches in Brazil where like the guys like flying in down the top and it's like really dramatic and there's lights everywhere, those things as well, even if they're winning on like silly stuff like that, that is still what gives them influence. Like more people believe in them. So that creates an informal hierarchy where those people have more power over what people believe, over their doctrine, than other people. So that's if you're centralized. The alternative is if you want to argue that religions are decentralized, which is often very, very useful, right? So if you think about those debates I was talking about earlier, the debate that's like we should elect local religious leaders. If you can prove that the doctrine of local religious leaders is decentralized, so religions are already constructed by what people on the lower levels believe, that means that this is a much better case, right? That supports the gov, because it suggests that if it is the case that everyone's already forming the decisions, you may as well just elect them and get the process over with and make it simpler. And that neutralizes a lot of the best op arguments, which is like people have bad opinions and so they're gonna jump through. And so if you want to establish that someone's decentralized, there are kind of two things you got to do. First thing you got to do is talk about the fact that many of the main religions we're talking about are decentralized. For examples are Sunni Islam. So the caliphs died out, I guess, at the latest with the Ottoman Empire, people say earlier, but at the latest when the end of the Ottoman Empire ended, the caliphs died out. And so after that, local members of the clergy are just who you talk to. So if you want to go like ask what something is the case and you're a Sunni Muslim, which is the majority of Muslims, you will go ask your local member of the clergy. You won't go ask like some spiritual advisor who's going to tell you what the Pope has said. You can ask a local member of the clergy. Same thing with Protestantism, which, as I mentioned, the stats bit is going to be very big. They'll be the most of the Christians by 2050. That has a lot of different denominations. Like there are a lot of different Protestants. Sometimes they try and create hierarchies, but not very effectively. So some Protestants say we're the main Protestants, and there's these like other Protestants who don't really count. But even then, it's like they're not really a hierarchy. It's not a lot of control. Thirdly, Hinduism, which has denominations, which are like mostly, as far as I can tell, I'm not a Hindu expert, but as far as I can tell, most Hinduist denominations are determined based on stuff like your local traditions or things like which particular deity you see as superior. So particular types of Hinduism value people like Shiva stronger than other people. But again, there's no structure, right? There's not like one particular person who tells you what to think in that system. And finally, the same is true in Buddhism, which has different schools. Theravada and Mahayana are the big ones. Theravada is like further over in Western Asia. Mahayana is broadly speaking Eastern Asia. So that's like if you're in China or if you're in Japan or South Korea. But again, they don't have a structure, right? They're not telling you what to do. So the first thing you can do to prove that religion is decentralized is refer to all of those cases where it is just the case that there's no structure. Or alternatively, what you can do is establish that decentralization happens even when a religion is formally centralized. And the way that happens is threefold. Firstly, I think you can point out that when most people engage with religion, the things that matter to the way they engage with religion is mostly social stuff that's quite close to you. Like if I'm like engaging with God, most of my mediations with God, whatever kind of Abrahamic faith I believe in, are probably not going to be engagements where I'm like, okay, this like really niche doctrinal issue over the Trinity that like the popes have resolved at the Council of Nicaea. It's going to be like, okay, well, like I want to cheat on my wife, is that allowed? Or like I want to do like, I want to masturbate, is that allowed? Can I use contraception, etc. And that's questions that you're not going to ask God. It's questions that you'll primarily ask your local leader. Secondly, because of the social church, so the people that you meet kind of on a day-to-day basis are the ones that matter to you. The people that kind of chat to you at church or the people that chat to you at the mosque are the ones that kind of inform your ideas about religion. And thirdly, because the kind of people that interpret scripture need to do it in context. So a really classic example is if you ever go to a church, most of the time the sermons won't be about like the niches of doctrine. They'll be about like, this is the problems facing the world today. And the pastor will be like, yeah, I think the problem is like no one has peace, or no one has love in their heart. And the way they explain that is not Jesus says this, end of story. They're like, Jesus says this, here is what is happening in the world today. Here's how I'd apply this to context. So again, the way that people's ideas of religion are formed, even in a very top-down religion, is formed at the bottom up. Secondly, even if there are religious hierarchies, and teams are like, well, Catholicism has a hierarchy, those hierarchies are often pretty ineffective. So a classic example is a guy called Raymond Burke, who's like, in my humble opinion, like the most evil guy ever. Like he's this like comically evil American bishop, who if you've watched that movie Conclave, like the really, really evil bishop, he's like the really evil bishop, but he's American, so he's even worse. And Raymond Burke like hated Pope Francis, they had like massive beef. And Pope Francis basically tried to do his best to get rid of Burke. And he was like, we're going to, he kicked him out of his apartment, he took away some of his responsibilities. But basically he didn't get rid of Burke. Like Burke was still the most influential American cardinal, he still showed up at the conclave, like he's still quite powerful and pushing for people. So the problem with hierarchy is that it's not very good. Like these aren't like governments where they have the power to like fire people really effectively, especially the more informal religions. It's quite hard to make hierarchy stick. And the final thing is that there are a lot of studies which suggest that lots of people don't actually understand their religion as much as you'd expect, which makes sense, right? Like most people who are religious are also, like plenty of people describe themselves as politically progressive and don't really know that much about progressivism, same with conservatism. Same thing is true for many people who call themselves religious. They say, I am Catholic. They might not know a lot about what Catholic doctrine suggests. I think 3 good examples of this are, firstly, 20% of American Catholics think they are literalists. So they think that if the Bible says something, you must follow the words of the Bible. And my suspicion about why this is the case is that they've learned this from the way people talk about the Constitution, where like, if the Constitution says X, conservative Americans like, I must follow the words of the Constitution. And they apply that doctrine to the Bible, which is not actually what Catholics think, as I'll talk about in a second. Secondly, there's been a big splinter movement after Vatican II, which is a controversial Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council, which happened in the late sort of 1900s. And the problem with the Vatican II is it did a bunch of progressive things. So it did a bunch of things like changing views on evolution, changing views on engagement with other religions, which people didn't like. That led to a splinter society, the Society of St. Paul X, which then got everyone excommunicated. And there's this whole beef where like a bunch of powerful religious figures in the Catholic world quit the society, quit the church, got excommunicated because of that. And thirdly, a really good example is folk saints. So in Christianity, many denominations, there are saints who are people that are kind of holy, that you hold up as more important. Same thing is true in Islam. But Islam is very decentralized about how you pick them. So Islam's just like, if there's someone who's important in a local area, it's often easier to pick them. You can see like, if you go to Eastern Europe, for example, there's lots of consecrated graves of saints. But the same thing is not true in Christianity, where you're meant to kind of have a centralized process of picking them. But this actually doesn't follow through. So in the real world, many people are venerated as saints locally, even when they're not meant to by the church, because like they were important to the community, and no one ever really told the community not to. So that I think is another example of the fact that even if a hierarchy says you're meant to do something, you don't actually do that thing. All right, does anyone have any questions so far? I know I like to talk at like a million miles an hour. No, we're all good? All right, send them, going through at the end, there'll be some more. The second kind of theme I wanted to talk about is religious interpretation. So most motions about religion, except for motions which are like, this house prefers a world, where like you replace X world with Y world. In those worlds, I guess you don't need to debate about reinterpreting, because you're not reinterpreting, right? You're just replacing a world where you believe in thing A with another magical world where you believe in thing B. But most debates aren't like that. Most debates are like, we would now preach X gospel. In which case, it is the case that prior to now, you would have been preaching Y gospel, and now you've got to change from Y gospel to X gospel. And I think, or my hot take, is that I think debaters are way too resistant to change in religion. So people's general belief is, op always wins these debates. And the reason op wins these debates is they get up and they're like, okay, well, if we take an example, St. Andrew's open. They're like, Amsterdam open. The Pope should mandate that future popes be democratically elected by all Catholics. So op wins these motions a lot. And the reason they win these motions is because they get up and they're like, okay, well, the Pope is going to say this, but that's not what the popes have said in the past. So everyone's going to hate the Pope and there's going to be lots of backlash, so we shouldn't do it. And they say that in literally any debate about religion, right? They're like, if you reinterpret what you think about religion, that doesn't actually matter because everyone's going to believe the old thing. And I think this is not true. So I think it's interesting to get good at debating about it, because it's not really the way the world works, and religion's changed a lot more. Two good examples. Firstly, I've done a lot of sort of history stuff, like not theology, but history stuff, on the way the church talked about sin in the Middle Ages. And basically the answer is they just changed their opinions a lot. So initially it was not illegal to have the Bible in the vernacular, which is kind of crazy, because like you hear about the Reformation, and the big thing in the Reformation was that Martin Luther wanted to have the Bible translated. Like that was one of the key complaints. But prior to a bunch of heresies in the 1200s, where the church got kind of upset at people doing the Bible in their own way, it was totally fine to have the Bible in the vernacular, and everyone kind of did it in the local language. Similarly, the Fourth Lateran Council, which is in the 1100s, was the first time they really locked in on clerical marriage, which is again such an issue today, right? Like so many people today have big fights over should you let clerics marry. There's a lot of, arguably there are a lot of harms caused by the fact that clerics don't marry. That wasn't really a thing until the 1100s. The Middle Ages also saw doctrines of like confession, where you go to confession, you profess yourself. Didn't really exist prior to the Middle Ages. You did penance very different ways. Purgatory as well, the idea that like after you die, you don't just go straight to heaven or hell. You go like to this, you might go to this other place where you pay for your sins and then you go up to heaven. That idea did not exist until not even like the church made it up, but just like certain writers started thinking about it, and then like the church kind of accepted it as fact. And then there's a really interesting article called book called Lower Than the Angels, which I recommend. It's a fun book. And this book suggests that even marriage comes about quite late. So for quite a long time, the church was pretty on marriage, and they're like, you probably shouldn't be having sex at all. And then later they kind of got into marriage and like, okay, this is pretty cool now. But kind of initially their take was you shouldn't have marriage at all. And so a lot of the stuff that we think of as rusted on opinions that Christianity has was not the case. Another good example, which I mentioned earlier, is that in the 19th century, as slavery as an institution broke down, and as people, I think, rightfully pushed back against slavery in the Muslim world, the way abolitionist movements pushed back against it across a lot of the Muslim world was to use context approaches to suggest that people had misinterpreted the Quran and the Hadiths, which are the words of Muhammad that he kind of kept about as part of the Islamic faith. They had misinterpreted those, and those had actually not been in favor of slavery. And as I understand it, I'm not Muslim, the debate, or the argument goes, Muhammad had these lines in the Quran and in the Hadiths, where he was like, this is what you should do to your slaves. You should manumit them as much as possible, so you should free them when you can. You should treat them with kind of humane respect, etc. You shouldn't make certain groups and certain religions slaves, etc. And so the people had previously believed those were just the rules, right? Like you're allowed to have slaves, but you have to follow these certain conditions with slaves. And the way that reinterpretation worked is they said, well, actually, Muhammad all along really wanted to free the slaves. And these were progressive steps in favor of freeing the slaves. But at the time that he was making those steps in 600, it was not really feasible to free them. Like society relied too much on them. There'd be lots of social unrest, etc. So instead, I'm going to enact policies which are anti-slavery. And so over time, slavery will die. And this interpretation is now kind of mainstream among most Muslim people. So the ijma, the consensus, which we'll talk about in a second, is that this is what Muhammad meant when he talked about slavery, which is why slavery is obviously prohibited in most of the Muslim world. This isn't perfect. So as I mentioned, Boko Haram and ISIS both disagree with this. But most Muslims, I think, would say that slavery is immoral and it is not supported by the Quran. So if it is the case that people are reinterpreting their religion a lot, the interesting question is, how are they reinterpreting their religion? And the answer, I think, has to do with how centralized their religion is. So I've got three ideas about how people do this. Two on this slide, the one's next slide. For, I think, very decentralized religions, the best explanation is just that new denominations can proliferate at the expense of old ones. So if you think about, for example, ways that Protestantism changes over time, a lot of the conservative Protestant groups that align with Donald Trump, the Catholics also align with him, but the conservative Protestants align with Donald Trump, are new churches or churches that haven't been around for very long. So people who previously believed X thing, now switching faith to a church that might agree with them more politically. Similarly, Hindutva, which is the nationalist version of Hinduism. This is very influential in India these days because Modi and the BJP quite like that. That came about in the 19th century. And the way it came about, which we'll talk more about in a second, is that there were previous denominations of Hinduism, like the four I mentioned earlier. And people stopped believing in those, and they started believing this new one that was more nationalist and kind of incorporated Western stuff. And so people, even if there is no formal way to change religion, can just start believing in the different version of the religion, which is a way for religions to change subtly without anyone noticing it, right? Like suddenly everyone's believing in a different sect. There are different leaders they think are telling them what to do, which is how Hinduism went from a very, very broad religion. Like Hinduism traditionally has been a religion with like thousands of different opinions. Like there's like Zoroastrian elements, there's like elements that believe in all these different gods. And these days Hinduism, in the way that people talk about it, even in India, is very monolithic. They're like, Hinduism is this one thing. Like everyone's a Hindu or not a Hindu. And the reason that is that there were more unified versions of Hinduism that supplanted all of the old ones. Secondly, for more centralized religions, one way you can do it is have concepts of doctrine over consensus, where you can have, if everyone believes in and agrees that a certain thing is true, you will follow that and make sure that that is respected. And I think the most formalized case of this is Sunni Islam. So Islam theoretically is literalist, which means that if you look at what the Quran and the Hadith say, you have to follow through on what those say. The difficulty is the same problem with the Constitution in the US, which is you can look at the words, but then you have to ask, what do the words mean? And then you have to start having arguments about like, why are people saying one thing or other? And so, because they have to do things like exegesis, which is where you have to work out what the words mean, and you have to do stuff like Sharia law, which is like, well, if you're applying the principles of Islam to new things that don't exist, like for example, banks, which are, there's many Islamic banks. Muhammad didn't have banks. Like how do you apply what Muhammad said about you should not invest money in haram stuff to like, can I put my money in an index fund that has haram stuff? The answer to which is no, like there's special index funds that don't have stuff like gambling and pork. But in theory, you've got to kind of make sure that you follow this. And that's led to the doctrine of consensus in Islam, in Sunni Islam, which is you have these things called tafsirs, where clever people who are respected inside Sunni Islam, they write these tafsirs and they produced works that suggest you should interpret the book in this way. They might focus on a particular hadith, they might focus on all of the Quran, and they say, here's how I think you should interpret this. And then the doctrine of ijma is, if there is a tafsir that everyone agrees is correct, then you can just adopt that as doctrine, and that becomes the case that everyone is meant to believe in that. So a good example is, one of the reasons that the golden age of Islam was able to quite effectively come up with scientific doctrine at the same time as like the West was like backwards and like, no scientific development was happening in the West and Islam was doing it all, is that Christianity was a very stuck religion that often prohibited many of the thoughts that people were talking about. People would be denounced as heretics. Whereas there were these very influential tafsirs, like the Tafsir al-Raza or Razi, which were texts that were like, actually science is cool and we like science and that is compatible with Islam. And those texts became very popular. A lot of kind of wealthy, powerful people bought into them and like read them and suggested them and shared them. And so the ijma very quickly became, we should adopt things like the Tafsir al-Razi. So the entire Muslim world, all of the kind of caliphs or the caliphates that had splintered by this point, all followed through and made things more scientifically rationalist. So that's the second approach. And the final approach is that you can have a top-down process of changing doctrine. So in very centralized religions, like the Catholic Church is the best example, it is actually the case that you can just have people use their magisterium to change the church. And so when you have those debates that I talked about a second ago, where it's like, we would change doctrine to believe X thing rather than Y thing, again, people will be like, well, if the Pope changes his mind and like suggests that stuff is totally different to how it was, that will lead to a lot of backlash. And that is true in some cases, but I think it is also not true in other cases. And the reason is that Catholicism, and also mainstream Judaism, interestingly, which I haven't talked about a lot because Judaism is numerically quite minuscule relative to other religions, for the reason that it's very selective about who can be a Jew. But mainstream Judaism, as well as Catholicism, follow what's called a historical critical method, which is like, it's not just what the words say, it's also like the context around the words and like the history, so you've got to kind of figure out what people think. So a really good example is that quote from Pope Pius XII, who said, "For what you want to express is not to be determined by the rules of grammar alone, nor solely by the context, but also like other history stuff, like work out what they would have intended to say." In the same way that progressives treat the Constitution, right? They're like, well, the right to abortion is not technically covered by the amendment that protects privacy, but if you kind of think about what they're intending there, part of that is the right to abortion, which is, I guess the progressive argument for Roe v. Wade. And so some interesting moderations include Catholicism integrating evolution. So a common misconception is that Catholics don't think evolution is real. Most Catholics in Catholic doctrine suggest that evolution is in fact real, but they do believe there's a debate over anthropogenesis, which is like evolution is real, but are humans created separately to other people? Similarly, things like polygenesis, like evolution is real, but were there firstly Adam and Eve, or is that kind of like a metaphor and Adam and Eve weren't really a real thing? So it's like, they agree that evolution exists. They debate whether humans experienced evolution the same way that other animals might have, but they agree that evolution exists. Similarly, the Vatican II, which is the one that led to, I mentioned earlier, led to vernacular languages in Mass, so giving Mass in English as opposed to giving Mass in Latin. Things like getting rid of archaic practices. So though it seems like when you watch the conclave and stuff, they like do all this like crazy, stupid stuff, a lot of that's way simpler than what they used to do. Like it used to be way more intense. There's always like stories of old conclaves, if you read them, where like stupid stuff happens, like they go in there for like 3 years and they like take the roof off to convince them to stop being in conclave, because there's so many practices around how conclaves are done. Things like religious freedom. So Dignitas Humanae is an encyclical that was passed at Vatican II that said, okay, you should not be doing things like coercing people into believing in a religion. And even things like a positive view of Judaism and Islam, which is like, there's a doctrine called Nostra Aeternus, which is like, well, at least they're Abrahamic, right? At least they agree that God exists. They've just got some other disagreements. And thirdly, a way to recognize local leaders in the Catholic Church is to do saint stuff. So I mentioned earlier that theoretically you're not meant to appoint saints of your own control. The church is meant to do it. But the church can become more progressive by appointing saints. So some good ones. Shout out Australia, Mary MacKillop, who was our first saint, started a nice school and they liked her, so like we're gonna make her accepted. And that brings Australians on side of the church. Other things like a Dalit rights activist or someone who spoke out against the dictatorship in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, those two people were given sainthood. And the reason is that they wanted to make the church look more progressive. So that's the historical critical method, right? The Catholic Church is like, we can re-look at the Bible and think about the context around the Bible and interpret it in different ways. So for example, evolution. Theoretically, the Bible says everyone was made in 7 days and animals didn't evolve. But that might be a metaphor, right? There might not actually be literally 7 days. Or maybe there were 7 days, but like time was sped up. So like evolution still happened. Or maybe there was 7 days, but the animals at the end are not the animals we have today. And after the 7 days, all the animals started evolving. There are many ways that this could have happened. I still though think that is quite limited. The reason that it is quite limited is firstly, the church is quite unwilling to apply this method to any of the really important stuff. So if you look at like early doctrine, things like the idea of like Jesus Christ being divine, or the idea of the Trinity, are not really that well enunciated in the first few texts of Christianity. Like they come about like a couple hundred years later. So many people, if you apply this method correctly, would say, well, actually, I guess the Trinity isn't real, right? Like the Trinity comes out later. That's a thing that is very, very contested. Secondly, people are trying to debate Islam. So they're trying to apply this method as well to Islam because there was a recent paper which suggested that the hadith about Muhammad having a child bride was not correct, or was like made up by someone who didn't really know Muhammad, so the hadith doesn't count. And so there's a lot of debate over whether you can apply this to Islam and then like use the same method to work out if the hadiths written about Muhammad are actually correct or not really correct. And so many people, I think, who are Islamic today, many Muslims you'll talk to, will often reject many of the hadiths entirely and be like, yeah, the stuff that people said Muhammad believed in, that doesn't really count. Like the only thing that counts is the Quran, which is what he actually wrote down that he believed in. And so I think a lot of the kind of debates about this are debates about, can you apply the method that's worked reasonably well in Catholicism on a top-down level to people doing that on a bottom-up level in the rest of society? And that again is a question of reinterpretation. The final thing I'll talk about, I know we're running a little low on time, some examples of reinterpretation. Here are 5 that I think are interesting. You can bring up in debates. There are many more examples. These are just 5 that I think illustrate different points. The most common, famous one that people talk about is liberation theology. So after Vatican II, so in the 1960s, the Latin American churches, and particularly local Latin American leaders, looked around their societies and went, wow, the government sucks and everyone is poor. And this is pretty bad. And we need to figure out a way to teach to people that accepts the fact that the government sucks and everyone is poor. And the way they accepted that is they came up with the doctrine of liberation theology, which is that the words of Christ, when he talks about things like the poor are the ones that have lots of power and are more dignified, are in fact a doctrine that accepts that people are poor and says that those people are the ones who are more morally righteous. They're the ones that have more power. They're the ones that will inherit more when they go to heaven, because they're the ones that have suffered and struggled the most. And they do things like interpret the words about Jesus being the sword of social disorder and say that is not like he's meant to be the sword that gets rid of social disorder, but he is the sword that in fact brings social disorder. Things like social revolution are in fact supported by Jesus. And liberation theology became extremely, extremely popular. It was quite a bottom-up movement. The church initially hated it. So Ratzinger, who is one of the popes, Ratzinger really didn't like it. Francis is a bit more kind of okay with it. But these people actually had enormous influence in Latin America. So the Nicaraguan government, which some people may know is a socialist dictatorship, that movement, the FSLN, was loads of clerics who believed in liberation theology. So the revolutionary socialist movement had a bunch of Christian priests in it because the Christian priests believed in this doctrine. And even today, Nicaragua's government has a lot of clerics involved. A lot of Christians believe in the Nicaraguan government because the government follows through on those doctrines. And this liberation theology movement has spread elsewhere. So Black liberation theology, also kind of quite influential in the US. Dalit liberation theology and Palestinian liberation theology are 2 other cases of people who kind of taken those same ideas, translated them from we're not fighting against poverty per se, we're fighting against social oppression in the way that manifests in India and Palestine. But again, it's kind of the doctrine of using liberation theology to fight against people. One incidental thing to note is that The opposite doctrine has also developed. So you might hear people talk about what's called the prosperity gospel, which is also a Christian doctrine. And the prosperity gospel is the opposite, which is liberation theology says, yes, you are not wealthy here on earth. Yes, your conditions are bad, but you'll be repaid for that in heaven. Prosperity gospel, which is way more influential these days, the liberation theology is kind of less influential. Prosperity gospel is like, you are not wealthy now. If you believe in God, God will give you material returns on earth. So the prosperity gospel is like, if you follow my church, you will get lots of returns on earth. And you can think of some cynical reasons why many televangelists who make lots of money when people give them to their church tell you that if you give to their church, you'll get lots of money. And secondly, the big development is Christian evangelicism. So the biggest, I think fastest growing statistically version of Christianity is evangelicism, which is just, as I mentioned, often one individual or kind of individual pastors who join together who are very influential. People following them, they've grown crazy big. Thirdly, Islamic feminism, which uses the same approach I mentioned earlier of reinterpreting the text in context. So there are many words in religious texts that are contested and could mean lots of different things, where we've picked one interpretation and chosen that as the one we translate. So a good example is like, there are people in Hebrew who are trying to retranslate Hebrew to have a gender neutral pronoun because they say that the pronoun people use to talk about God is not the God pronoun, it's the gender neutral pronoun. And it just happens as being used in the Torah and so on to talk about God because God was gender neutral. Same thing is happening in Islam, where they're saying, well, actually all the words you use that were like, men should have this power over women, etc. In fact, it's just like people should have this power over other people that respect them. Reinterpret the words. I think it's interesting if you've got the time to read about the history of Islamic fundamentalism. So the development of like groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram is pretty recent. And though in our minds we're like, well, these are radical groups, so they must be kind of more traditionalist or conservative, their interpretation of doctrine is like pretty crazy. Like most Muslim scholars, even like the 1800s, would be like, what are these guys doing? Like they have no idea. So a lot of the kind of developments that led to those movements came about politically and were kind of reinterpretations. And as I mentioned, Hindu nationalism these days, very, very influential, but initially it was quite crazy. Like initially most Hindus would have said this is a very, very radical departure of what we believed in. And it initially came about as part of a very fascist model. So the RSS was this movement that was like, we believe in this new Hindu nationalist form. Also, we believe that like Mussolini and Hitler have they've got the like right way of organizing movements. And then they followed that model. The RSS later became the BJP, which is a bit sus for Modi. So all of those are reinterpretations, right? Some of them are good, some of them are bad. But there are doctrines that are being reinterpreted all the time. And I think one of the important things to remember in any of these debates is it is possible to change how religions believe. That is useful for most debates. And it's also useful to explain how religions choose to change. So if you believe, for example, if you can make arguments that religions change in a top-down way, you might say it's very hard to change them, right? If it's like, you've got to convince the Pope of something, the Pope is pretty traditionalist, they don't like to change things. But if you think that religions are bottom-up and it's consensus, then it's much easier. Alrighty, final thing I want to talk about is religious importance. I promise this is less lengthy. I guess any debate about religion, it's important to impact whether religion is good or bad. Some recent examples, the North American novice final was we support a rising religious following. I guess the debate is just like, is religion good? The Canadian Grand Quarterfinal was we prefer a belief with everyone believing in this certain type of religion. Finally, the Oxford WGM final last year was raising your child religious. So there's a lot of debates that happen a lot of the time, which are like, should you believe in religion? Like, is it good for you? There are many kind of boring answers to this, which you could call stock, which is like just the word for something when it's like everyone runs the same argument the same way. The boring same argument, same way things is like, religion is good because it gives you meaning or hope, or like it gives you morality. Religion is good because it gives you things like community and shared identity. And then the reasons for religion being bad is like, well, it causes conflict and it's coercive, etc. And the problems with these is that if everyone is running the same argument, that is not very useful to you. So I think the best way to think about debating is like, most people have certain things that they all will run. And in those times, it's quite hard to win if you have that knowledge. So especially if you're closing, right, you need to have something new compared to opening. But even if you're an opening, if you're just running the standard reasons that religion is good, like your OG, and CO is like religion is meant to be bad, they can just rebut all of your reasons because they've heard them a million times before. So it becomes very easy for teams to beat you if you're just running all of the standard stuff people say. So I think something fun is to think about, are there ways to make arguments about whether religion is good or bad? I have 6 that I think are fun to think about. My favorite is the last one, which is a guy called Paul Seabright, who wrote a really funny book recently, where he talked about kind of the economics of religion. And in this, he made the argument that religion is really useful as a dating site. So if you go and you join a church, many people's secret motivation that they won't admit to themselves is that at church you can meet people that are pretty reliable because they believe in God. Like they, you know that they're showing up to like church all the time. You know that they are following through on certain behaviors. They're probably going to act morally, etc. You can just like meet good single partners at church. And so many people secretly, whether they admit it to themselves or not, use church as a way to meet potential partners. Some other good ones are influence on art. So a guy called Alain de Botton, who's quite cool, wrote a good book about religion for atheists, and he talks a lot about religion being influential for art. So he says that the ways that, I guess if you like look around the Netherlands, right, you're like, wow, there's some pretty crazy churches. Those churches are beautiful themselves, but they also pushed art forward. Like a lot of the developments in art were people trying to do better and better depictions of religion. Even today, things like recently there's been a big movement in a lot of American institutions to base new developments in art on traditional Sufi traditions. And Sufism is a relatively niche variant of Islam that is more esoteric, so it has a lot more kind of like your personal individual relationship with God. And as I understand it, Sufi Islam has a big tradition of singing, so it's called Qawwali. And so that influence of Sunni Islam singing has become really influential for a lot of mainstream artists. A lot of people who you might know have been using that as a way to inspire their work. Secondly, on charity, quite a while ago, like 1950s, a Catholic argued that Catholicism was really good, shockingly, in a book about the social miracle, which suggested that in the 1000 to 1500 period especially, Christianity did a lot of really great stuff for charity. So things like indulgences, which we all think are pretty bad because Martin Luther was pretty against them and popularized the idea that they're pretty stupid. Many of the indulgences were things that were quite good. So indulgences were often given for like donating to mental asylums or given for people like, if you were someone that had like gone blind and you couldn't like care for your family, you could go to the clergy and they'd give you an indulgence. So if someone gave you money, they could get like some time off their labor in purgatory. And like the reason the church did that wasn't really because it was like helping the church. It was mostly because it was good for society that people were given those kinds of supports. So it's arguable that there is religious benefits from charity. There are a lot of debates about this. So many people suggest that in fact many religions are very bad because they're coercive. They force you to go to charity. They also obviously don't do like progressive taxation. So many religions are like, you have to type your income. Some religions are like, you type 10% of your income. Other religions are just like, we want everyone to give us some money, which obviously hits poorer people more than it hits richer people. Fourthly, religion is quite influentially radical. So another good Catholic, who's I guess kind of interesting if you want to hear someone who is Catholic argue why they think it is good, is the historian Tom Holland, who is distinct from the much more famous actor Tom Holland. The historian Tom Holland is also gorgeous and is a really nice guy. And he wrote a good book called Dominion, which is a very long book. And there's a very good podcast, Past, Present, Future, which interviewed him, which is much shorter, much nicer. And in this podcast / book, he argues that Christianity was like super woke at the time. Like when Christianity started, the idea that like you would get put up on a cross, which is what you would give to slaves, and that would be honorable and good is kind of like a crazy idea. Like at the time, no one believed that being strung up on a cross and killed and like that being honorable was something that no one considered. So his conception is that Christianity was very radical because it gave a lot of people the idea that even the lowliest in society could achieve greatness, could be glorious in that way. Fifthly, religion's influence on trade and ideas. So Indonesian history, if you look into it, is totally about, there are developments that happened when people who are Muslim, because Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, when Muslims from Indonesia went on pilgrimage to the Hajj, they would like find out stuff in Saudi Arabia about like how the world was working and like bring it back to Indonesia. So there were these like 6 waves of jihad where like the government in Indonesia would just like get totally overthrown and like new kingdoms would emerge. And the reason that happened is like a bunch of people had come back from Hajj. There was like this new idea that had happened and everyone suddenly started believing this new idea. And finally, even if you don't think religion is interesting in any way, shape or form, you might think that money is interesting. And religions have an awful lot of money. The Vatican famously has a bank, a sovereign wealth fund, and a pension fund. And the 3 of them together own like bajillions of dollars. Like the Vatican is so rich. It still manages to run a deficit. It's like 83 million euros in deficit each year, which is quite bad, but it still has a lot of money. And so even if you care not all about religion, you can run arguments into like, well, the government of religion matters because it is what determines who ends up having money. For example, if you elect a better pope, maybe that pope is more likely to give money to churches in the developing world who desperately need money to do stuff like hospitals, rather than give the money to like really fancy sacraments in the Rome where you don't really need the money. So there's a lot of debates, I think, about where religion ends up. All right, that's all from me. Anybody have questions? I know I like just talked at a million miles an hour in a weird accent. Yes.
So in terms of like prepping for these debates, have you read all these books? Like, how do you go about sort of
No,
doing this?
I wish I had. I have not. I think the useful things to do is like, one, there are usually articles which summarize these in good ways. So some like articles, some papers I like is like, if for religion specifically, the New Republic is pretty good. I'll send you some after. But there are a lot of good papers, I guess, where you can get specific articles that are useful. The second thing that's useful is to talk to religious people in your life. So many of you will have like religious friends, I guess, like maybe you are religious. And I think a lot of the best ways to think about religion in debates, the reason the debates suck oftentimes is because like it's a bunch of atheist debaters who all kind of have like Richard Dawkins opinions about religion. And like, I don't know, he's a nice guy, but like sometimes a bit silly. And so the debates are often best if you can talk to people who actually believe in religion, think out the ways that that affects their life, and become sensitive about it. And then thirdly, I think if you are following other stuff that is useful in debating, just try and keep an eye out for where religion comes up. So probably most people are not going to like Matterfile religion, even if like, even if you were like wanted to Matterfile, which is not really a very useful thing to do. But even if you wanted to like write a list of everything you needed to know for debating, you would never do that for religion. But you might do that for like what's happening in the Middle East this week, right? Like you might read the New York Times summary or the Financial Times summary or something of everything that's happened in the Middle East this week. And when you read that, you can notice the way that religion plays out. Or I guess last week or a couple weeks ago, everyone was talking about India, Pakistan over Kashmir. That fight, a lot of that is about religion, right? So even if you are learning about that for the purpose of, well, there might be a debate about India, Pakistan, you can like notice the times when they start talking about like, oh, here's why they hate each other. Here's why there's divisions. Was India and Pakistan really based on Muslim-Hindu divides, or was that something that was constructed by the British during partition? Those like you can kind of learn about it through other stuff, would be my thought. Any other questions? Yes.
So for the reinterpretation mechanisms, I feel like the three mechanisms you mentioned, they always lead to less unity of the entire church, no matter whether it's like a top-down approach or a competition between different scholars. So how would you weigh this argument of the church becomes less unified, or it like fractions down in debates?
Yeah, I get what you mean. I think there's some good mitigation of this argument. I will think out the best way. But the best mitigation of this argument, I think, is that the idea of a unified church is somewhat fake. Like in any faith, the idea of unity is a bit not real. And the reason is that people don't actually, as we mentioned, believe in all of the tenets of their religion. Like most people don't engage with religion enough that these divisions animate them. So the only times that division or lack of unity matters, in a real sense, is when it is sufficient to motivate people to act differently. So leave their church, go to another church, engage less with the church, join splinter movements like the Society of St. Pius. So I think the first thing to mention is like, the kind of changes we talk about in debates are often not enough to animate people, especially these days where people's engagement with the church probably isn't for doctrinal reasons. Like if you poll people, like why do you go to church? They say like, because my friends do and it like gives me meaning and hope. That often doesn't change. And then I think the weighing of this is like, if you side pro reinterpretation, be like, divisions in the church, rarely matter to the leaders. Like if it's an act debate from the leader's perspective, you can make a lot of arguments about why they still feel like them being right is fine because they'll be vindicated by history or something. And at a lower level, often that's useful. So a really good example of this is, you might know that Pope Francis did this kind of thing that people got very upset about, where he was like, you can bless same-sex marriage. So we don't support same-sex marriage. Francis like is on record, like we don't like gay people, but we can let them get married. Like if they've gotten married, we can be like, all right, we bless that marriage, we hope it works out. We don't do the same rituals as when we marry someone who is heterosexual, but we can bless it in some respect. And Francis did this in an encyclical, and some churches followed through. So the German church, for example, which is quite progressive, I suspect the Dutch church is similar, followed through and did this and made it very available. Other churches, like those in Africa, didn't. And so oftentimes that division is quite useful because any one opinion would be hard if everyone had to follow a certain opinion. That would be very bad for the church. Like it would be very bad for Christianity if either everyone had to bless same-sex couples or no one had to, because like the German church would hate it or the African churches would hate it. But if you can maintain a kind of division where like everyone still respects the Pope, they generally follow through on the Pope, but they slightly disagree with each other about which particular interpretation of religion to follow, that actually helps out, like it kind of makes it stronger, would be my response to that claim.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Alrighty, thank you for showing up guys. Hope that was useful. Cheers.